Josh, you did with the B.H Roberts Foundation, you sent a survey out to over 2,500 people affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whether current members, less active members, former members. If people were to ask me in England what a stereotypical Latter-day Saint was like, they would probably describe an uber conservative Republican guy. Uh, how accurate from doing the survey is that view, would you say?
Well, we didn't survey anyone in the UK.
Yeah.
So and also, in addition to that, we actually didn't we didn't do any political surveying. We didn't ask any questions about politics. That's been done that's been done before. Specifically, Pew did a survey, right around when, Mitt Romney was running for president. People were very interested in Latter-day Saints at that time in a political context. And so at the B.H. Roberts Foundation, we didn't do anything politically oriented as far as the questions we asked. We were interested in beliefs and practices of current and former Latter-day Saints. And we actually sent the survey out we sent postcards to 80,000 people in the Mormon corridor, or what we call the Mormon corridor. Basically, any county that had more than 15% Latter-day Saint population based on the religious census survey. And then in addition to that, to get the rest of the country, we advertised on Meta to anyone who had some sort of affiliation or interest in Utah things. Meta won't allow you to target religions, but someone was interested in BYU football or the University of Utah. Um, we would just throw out the ad there and say, "Hey, do you want to take the survey?" And we had enough of a response from those random ads and the random postcards to get we had about 3,800 respondents, and then from that. We kind of throw out the ones that are invalid for a variety of reasons and do some math, and we end up with something that's reasonably representative of current and former Latter-day Saints in the United States.
I know it would be impossible to get it fully, this is representative fully, but, it is a fascinating survey. And I know you didn't test politics, but you did do something very interesting in kind of testing what I'll say Latter-day Saints, but you know what I mean by that. Obviously, you can't guarantee that everyone is fully active or whatever. But you applied the moral foundations theory from Jonathan Haidt, whose work I love, and that kind of could you explain the results? And I'd
Sure.
be interested to know if that's the result you expected from specifically the moral foundations theory segment.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I don't know if your listeners, if they're familiar with the moral foundations theory. So Jonathan Haidt, in the early part of the 21st century here, early 2000s, he and a couple other researchers were interested in trying to find out what are there foundational values that people use to make decisions about important things in life. What is their morality made up of? And I think one of the motivations for that is you can ask people, political questions or ideological questions that align with politics, and they'll usually just say, "Oh, well, I'm a this, I'm a that, and this is how we answer." To kind of remove the tribalism from the bias of these answers, moral foundations finding out the moral foundations is one way to sort of cut through all that and find out what's at the root of how we as humans think about these types of things. And what Haidt and his colleagues discovered, or what they proposed really, are 5 moral foundations. Depending on the set you use, there's 6. Some people have proposed 7, but there's 5 moral foundations. And those foundations are basically the basis of how we make decisions, is the idea. So the first one is called harm care, and that's basically how much you value, um, how important it is to not harm people. Um, Fairness or reciprocity is the next value. How important is fairness? The next one is in group or loyalty. So an example of that might be, uh, how should we, so let's say a member of our family does something wrong. um, does it matter that they're a member of our family or not? Should we treat them differently, or have that in, how much do we owe them because they're a member of our family, even though maybe they did something wrong? um, Authority or respect. So an idea might be, how much do you value the rule of law? The law says this. Do we respect that? How much do we value that authority in making our decisions? And the last one is purity or sanctity. And so this has to do with sort of the divine. Do you think things are inherently pure or sacred just because we decide they are? Or do you think, hey, that's nonsense, that should never factor into our moral equation? So anyway, those are the five values. And so the question is, do current Latter-day Saints have a signature, a recognizable signature of moral foundations? And do former Latter-day Saints also have a recognizable signature? This has been done in politics, and it turns out people that are self-identify as liberal or progressive have a very distinct signature, and people that self-identify as conservative also have a distinct signature. And so we thought, well, let's see if we can see something in the current and former Latter-day Saints. And not surprisingly, I guess, well, we were hoping we'd see one, and we did. It was very distinct between the current and former Latter-day Saints. And we even broke it down even further to look at different types of Latter-day Saints, to see if we could see differences there as well. Something I also want to point out is that moral foundations, if you score high in, say, fairness, but low in purity, it doesn't necessarily mean that you only care about fairness and you don't care about purity at all. It just means that you prioritize them differently. Um, and also, it's not a mutually exclusive scale. You can score high in all of them, meaning you value, or when you're making decisions, you consider all these different values in your decision. Whereas other people might say, well, I only care about these two or these three.
Right. So if you were an alien or someone who had no kind of preconceived notion of the Latter Day Saints and the culture of it and the theology of it, what would your reaction be to those high level results from that activity? I don't know the word for it as you look at it, because it was interesting, because as you say, it was a distinct signature. It wasn't a carbon copy of the conservative ideology or
Now,
the progressive ideology. It was quite different,
yeah,
actually.
yeah, it was quite different. What we found was that Latter Day Saints are, not surprisingly, lean more conservative as far as their signature goes. They're actually closest to moderate. If you compare them to the average politically moderate American, their signature is very similar to that, with one exception. Latter day Saints score incredibly high on the purity scale. So, not surprisingly, we care a lot about the divine and the sacred and the pure. And this is not necessarily referring to chastity or sexual purity. That's a component of it, but it's generally just this concept of holding things sacred. So the average American, whether they're conservative or moderate or liberal, they just don't care about purity much. I mean, a little bit, but conservatives tend to a little bit more than liberals. But we're off the charts. Latter-day Saints are off the charts with sacredness.
That's interesting. As I didn't know that. I obviously saw the results, but I thought it was mostly relating to chastity and
Yeah,
things of
yeah,
that
yeah.
nature.
If you dig into it, no, chastity is definitely a component, but no, it's like, for example, if there was a Buddhist temple, you know, is it a building or is it something sacred? If and should we bulldoze it? If someone scored really high in the purity scale, they might say, hey, wait a second, there's something special here. Whereas someone else who just said, well, there's just a building and we need to bulldoze it because we need to make progress. So these are contrived examples. Obviously humans are much more complicated than that, but yes, it's not just about the concept of chastity.
Right. I find that now that you've brought that to light, I find that so fascinating. It makes me want to. I mean, to what extent did you try to interpret and the data and speculate about why this is, or why, or was it primarily a data
Well,
gathering
it's
activity?
it's always tempting, of course, to try. We all look at the data, and they're like tea leaves, and we say, "What does this mean?" And we can say what the data is, uh, but saying why it is, hard to say, right? So
Yeah.
so we that's sort of left as an exercise to the reader. Um, I think there certainly are some things that most people would agree make sense as to why things are the way they are with the moral foundations. Obviously, we are taught that there is a plan of salvation, and there is a God and a Father in heaven, and there is a sense of right and wrong and good and evil, and this idea of the sacred is sort of uh, part of our DNA. So it's not surprising that we value that quite high. Nowadays, of course, America is, quickly moving towards a secularized society, and the sacred is just sort of an antiquated notion to many people. And so we definitely stand out in that regard. What was also interesting is just generally Latter day Saints are relatively balanced in these five foundations. Um, and that's in contrast with former Latter day Saints. Former Latter day Saints are, for lack of a better term, very imbalanced in how they value these morality. Fairness and harm are very high for former Latter day Saints. It's very important to them that things are fair and that no one's hurt. Uh, Aside from those two values, they don't really value anything else. Relatively speaking, and within the context of moral foundation, um, you can fairness and harm are referred to as individualizing values, uh, whereas authority and in group and purity, those are socially binding values. And what that really means is that the one set of values that are socially binding tend to benefit the group, whereas the individualizing are really more oriented towards the self. And so former Latter Day Saints are very high on the self. Um, they actually mirror uh, um, people that identify as liberal. In fact, their signature is very similar to self-identified strong liberals. Uh, One exception is that they're actually in the binding values significantly lower than liberals. So even more so, they seem to not value the concept of respect or authority or in group or loyalty, and purity is pretty rock bottom, pretty low. And that's their signature. So it's a and the big question, of course, is why. Um, And I think people can speculate about why that is. Another big question um, is when, right? Um, I think it's reasonably safe to say that a shift occurs in values from disaffiliation. Um, does that happen immediately? Does that take months? Does it take years? Um, what type of influences are involved in that process of disaffiliation when it comes to values? But it certainly seems to be present in the data. I think there's a lot of fascinating future work that could be done in that area of finding out why that shift in value occurs, but it certainly does.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking about I read a study recently about it was a new study that came out analyzing primarily the UK, but US also during the COVID and levels of unhappiness
Mhm.
and suffering during the main lockdown periods. And it showed overwhelmingly that those with religion and separately with religiosity as well were so much less unhappy. And when interviewing surveyors about it, it was this sort of, well, we've got meaning, we've got something above this that we can look to, and so that kind of heightened purity valuation from Latter Day Saints kind of reminds me about that, and the how really it actually makes me feel quite grateful for my knowledge of the plan of salvation and things greater and the kind of community that we have that strengthens me. But again, I could go off on this tangent of speculation, which is, as you say, is so tempting and actually
Well,
really fun as well. But
yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with, I guess, speculating about data. I suppose as long as you put it in that context of, hey, I'm speculating here. Something interesting related to COVID and the pandemic. I think one of the values of harm or suffering, right? Latter Day Saints, I think, can contextualize, and maybe this is really all or most religious people can contextualize suffering um, as as a learning process, something that can be good, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, pain for no good reason is not something we desire, but I think we're taught that all pain can all things can be made to become good. Um, Whereas I think in a secular context, generally speaking, suffering is just something you know, not a lot of good can come of it. When we're unhappy and physically miserable, it's like, what's the purpose of this? We don't want to be in this state because there's no value in it. Whereas I think Latter Day Saints, we can see value in all things, including suffering, and so that might have something to do with how we took the pandemic, and also we can see that in and I think the moral foundations, because Latter Day Saints value the harm value, um, but not nearly as high as former Latter Day Saints or people that tend to be more secular. So we definitely consider it. Hey, is this harmful? That's a factor, but it's certainly not the only factor. Other things can outweigh harm. We can take harm if there's a return on that harm investment, so to speak, where there's something greater, a greater purpose that comes from it.
Which is a sense of duty, right? As that must be mixed in there of something I feel like we've lost a lot in society today is duty. You know, I look to my grandparents who served during wartime, and it's that let's do this together, let's go through this suffering, knowing that there's potential triumph at the end. Or, but again, it's fascinating to think of it. Which, considering the overall survey, not just the moral foundations part of it, which data set surprised you the most? And I'm sure you get that question all the time, but I'm interested
Yeah,
to
yeah,
know.
yeah. No, that's a fair question. I think anytime you get data like this, it's you know you you get surprised by the data. I think that uh, let's see here. I have some notes about kind of what surprises we found. Um, oh, okay, this is interesting. Um, so uh, we did an analysis called a k-means cluster analysis, where we basically took the Latter Day Saints and we did some mathematical modeling on it, and basically said, hey, look, is there some sort of statistical pattern in the answers that we're receiving? Is there some sort of grouping that can be formed from this? And that's essentially what k-means cluster analysis does. Is it basically finds clumps of groups, and we found two groups within the Latter Day Saint community. Uh, we found an 80% group, which is sort of the all-in group, I guess we call it. Those are the people that basically fall in line with the teachings of the church in their beliefs, and they're very active in their participation and their devotion. And then we found a 20% group, which we call sort of the selective group. They're not all in. They're in some ways. They're more selective, either in their activity or in their belief in God, or the belief in the literalness of the Book of Mormon, or in their participation in tithing. I mean, lots of different beliefs and practices, but they're more selective. However, they still identify as Latter-day Saints. So we have this sort of 80-20 grouping. And what was interesting, what surprised us, that didn't surprise us so much, that, because there's lots of different types of Latter-day Saints out there in the world that have different types of ideologies, and we find them in the pews with us, and we might be in different groups ideologically. What surprised us is that we found Gen Z just as representative in the all-in group as they were in the selective group. And what that means is that the younger generation, if they're in the church, they tend to be all in the church. If they're not in the church, they're out. But if they're in the church, they tend to be very strong, all in type of members, just as much as the boomers, just as much as Gen X. Now, the difference, which surprised us, was we found that wasn't true with millennials. Millennials overwhelmingly, proportionally, tend to be in that 20% selective group. In other words, if you're a millennial and you're in the church, you've got some things that you're just like, hey, I'm not okay with this. I don't buy into this, or maybe I don't really attend church that much, or I have issues with the temple, or I'm not sure that God is real. Whatever it is, there's some selectivity in millennials that seems to have skipped with Gen Z. We have this sort of aberration in the millennials, but when it comes to Gen Z, they're not selective. If they're in the church, they tend to be all in, all in. So that was pretty fascinating.
That really is. Oh, remind me, what age is millennials? Is that
So so the millennials, typically like born in 1983. So millennials are
right?
mostly in their 30s, early 40s right now. So they're in the
Right.
church. That means they are almost certainly married and have children, and that age group. They're starting to be in bishoprics and Relief Society presidencies, and they're sort of inheriting, beginning to inherit sort of the leadership in the church at a local level. And so that'll be fascinating to watch over the next decade, to see if we start to see the effect of that disproportionate representation in sort of the selective grouping.
That all-in cluster that you talk about was really interesting to me as I kind of thought about what that means, and it kind of gave me a chicken and egg paradox of I wonder which comes first. The strength of belief from those people who do go above and beyond in their belief. There were some incredible stats about belief in Joseph Smith, that he literally saw God the Father and Jesus Christ. That the Book of Mormon is a literal, historical, ancient record of a people. These people who believe it strongest are the ones who are always at church. And it led me thinking, is this something that, and I know you haven't tested this in the survey, so this may be a futile question, but is this something that we see in other faiths, or is this something unique to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And from that, this chicken and the egg of, well, are these people's belief stronger because they are so involved and so in it, and doing all the things, engaging callings, or is it the other way around, that you know the beliefs are coming before and then they're being confirmed by their church attendance? Is that, if that makes sense?
Sure.
um
Yeah, no, it's hard to say. I mean, I think as far as claims that the Latter Day Saint uh, religion makes, they're pretty unique, and they're pretty outside the mainstream sort of Judeo-Christian truth claims. Um, and and it's hard to say whether making sort of strong claims outside the norm makes you tend to have stronger belief. It's hard to say, but certainly the Latter-day Saints, at least in the data we received, and data from other national surveys, um, Latter-day Saints are very active, and the as far as adherence to their religion, we're one of the highest faiths in that regard. But yet our claims, the things that we believe, like Joseph Smith literally saw God, and there were literal historical people called the Nephites. Um, that's very outside the mainstream, uh, but yet we hold them to be true, and whether that compels us to attend and adhere to our religion, or if that's just incidental, hard to say.
Yeah, you have those surveys like State of the Bible and the I can't remember the names, but I read a ton of them, and that clearly showed that we were the top, or like second top religion in terms of those who engage with their religious texts several times a week, and those who are really active in what they're doing. And we know that these are good things. There's no point having a belief and not living according to your belief across all the metrics, which um, is why I like hearing about that so
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
It's
yeah. No, Latter Day Saints, as far as a sociological group of people, um, there's a lot of positive things to say about us. Surveys indicate high levels of mental health and happiness, and marital satisfaction is something we learned from the survey here. Is our if you get married in the temple, your likelihood of divorce is 3 times less than the national average. I mean, there's it's a good thing, sociologically speaking, to be a Latter Day Saint. Even data, and we didn't cover this in this data, but there's fascinating studies that have been done here. The Utah Department of Health did work with youth. That were sexual minorities, LGBTQ students, and suicidal ideation, and found that if you're a Latter-day Saint, your suicidal ideation is half of what it would be if you're not a Latter-day Saint. So it's in almost every regard, it's healthier to be connected with the Latter Day Saint faith, as opposed to not. And so that there's a lot of great news associated with that. And again, sociologically speaking, a lot of this isn't surprising. By every metric, people that tend to be more religious um, tend to be more positive across the board, with mental health and emotional health, and physical health, and that could speak to community. Really, if you're in a faith, you're in a community that is taught to love and take care of each other. And so there's a lot of natural sort of, well, of course it's going to work that way, type conclusions that could be drawn from that. But I think we like to think it's maybe there's something extra, and there may be, but regardless, the data is really strong in our favor in that sort of way. So it's good to be a Latter-day Saint.
I can just imagine some people outside the church or antagonistic to the church watching this and thinking, "Oh, this this is a great confirmation bias conversation about data," but
Sure.
which
Well,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
I
But the data is what the data is.
yes,
I mean,
and I rejoice in the data.
it's very difficult to argue, that that it's not healthy, to be a Latter-day Saint. Again, as far as the data indicates. Now, you can say, "Hey, that means not that has nothing to do with the church being true," and that's fair. That's fair. But I think if you get any group of humans together, that have some common values that are generally positive, and they work, with each other and nurture each other and reinforce each other, you're going to have positive outcomes. You throw in a layer of a health code into that, and even better. So again, I don't think any of this is a stretch, secularly speaking. That Latter-day Saints tend to be, in a good spot as far as the data goes.
No, yeah, I felt really annoyed seeing on Instagram the other day someone I know has a podcast and hosted a content creator who's been doing the rounds, slating the church
Mm.
recently, and some of the takes they were sharing were so bad that I thought I genuinely don't know if this person was actually a member of the church at any time. She was propagating that um, members of the church cannot differentiate between the harms of coffee and the harms of heroin. And so that when she when she
I,
left the church, her first sip of coffee, she was genuinely thinking that she would, go into a psychedelic state or something like that.
oh,
It was really ridiculous. I'm making it sound reasonable. That's how crazy it was.
well, what's interesting, I mean, the idea that perhaps, growing up in a culture where a health code is emphasized, can there be overemphasis? Can that, lead to a point where people grow up and they equate, heroin and coffee? Absolutely, absolutely. That's I'm sure that's the case, in our culture, Latter-day Saint culture as well. I think it's, difficult not to. It's difficult to prevent that. I mean, children. You teach a child, "Hey, stealing's wrong," and that's a fine thing to teach a child. Uh, but then you watch Les Mis, and you're like, "Wait, this person stole a loaf of bread. Is it still wrong?" And then it starts getting sort of nuanced because you become more mature and you have more context, and then you can say, "Well, generally speaking, stealing's wrong. There may be circumstances where it's right. Uh, you know, you know, is coffee bad for you? Well, our health code, we've decided that we're going to abstain from it. Will it kill you? Will you become this coffee junkie addict? No, no. But it goes against our health code, and this is something we've decided to sacrifice. And so, yes, I can you point a finger at, a culture that teaches their people, something that's maybe out of step with the mainstream? Yeah, of course, it's easy to ridicule that, and there is some truth to it, right? I mean, but that doesn't take away from sort of the I think the goodness, of
Oh
of
yeah,
the group as
yeah.
well.
But look at us having the intelligent capability to be able to decipher and see nuance in coffee drinking and health codes.
Sure. Yeah. 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 I mean,
Yeah.
it is our health code is sort of it's a fascinating topic. We can, um, yeah, some things are I think, again, data driven. Alcohol, abstaining from alcohol, I think it's very difficult to say, um, that alcohol provides uh, a positive, cost benefit analysis for society. I think any study of alcohol on a social level indicates that it's pretty horrific. Coffee, I think that's more difficult to argue. Cigarettes are definitely out of fashion now, but at a time, of course, they were considered, a tool of health. But in any case, we can have our kosher, practices, just like any other religion, and be okay with it, not obsess over it.
Speaking of these things, what did you find to be the most significant reasons people have left the church who were open to answering that?
Yeah, that's a really difficult. Of course, we did a very cursory set of questions on, hey, what issues were important to you, were an important factor in you leaving the church. The problem with asking that question, and a lot of people want to know, hey, why do people leave the church? It's There's been a fair amount of research done on reasons for divorce. Um, and what they've found is that it's very difficult, for people involved in a divorce, um, uh, to articulate why a divorce took place in a way that, makes sense. For example, if you asked a group of people that have been divorced, whose fault was the divorce, you would expect that, it should be 50-50, right? Well, it's not. Overwhelmingly, we as just people, it's a natural thing to do, is to blame the other people for the divorce. And of course, if you say who's at most fault, it can't be, everyone can't be at most fault. But we find that it's very difficult to in an emotional, uh, sort of separation like divorce, to be objective and to really understand, maybe the factors at play. In a very similar way, disaffiliation has the same difficulty in assigning, blame, or really articulating why. Um, there's a natural bias when you ask people, why they do what they do. Um, People want to be able to say, well, the reason I do what I do is for this good reason, not for this bad reason. It's for this mature, intelligent reason, not for this unintelligent, maybe petty reason. Whatever it is, right? And so when you ask someone very personal like that, why did you leave the church? And you give them a variety of options. It's
Mm.
a natural thing for them to say, well, I did it for these intelligent, good reasons. I didn't do it for these maybe less noble reasons. And so you're never going to get rid of that bias, unfortunately. So it's of course, not surprisingly, and it's been done many times. People have issues with, LGBTQ policies, uh, differences within genders in the church, historical reasons related to Joseph Smith, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's so none of that was surprising. I think that the correct way to think of it, of course, is what do former members of the church, like to say, uh, why they left the church? And we have the answers to that. We don't have the answers as to exactly what happened, because divorce or disaffiliation from a religion are complicated. There's not a monocausal, typically, it's not a monocausal situation. Um, there are all sorts of dynamics at play. And I think oftentimes when someone does disaffiliate with the church, they might not even be able to really understand sort of the process that took place. It might take years for them to be retrospective and about understanding that. But I think more often than not, I would suspect, and I'm speculating, that that we tend to grab a narrative and say, well, this was my narrative. This is what happened to me, and this is why I decided to do this. And here they create a narrative and a story, that has elements of truth to it, and maybe rose-colored glasses, or sort of armchair quarterbacking, whatever you want to call it, to sort of create something that they can live with and feel good about.
Yeah, I think that putting it across in a way analogous to a marriage or a divorce, I think what you've said is a very wise and respectful way of putting that across. I can imagine uh, less virtuous people might come back with those results and go, "Well, we got some juicy results we can tell you about." But you're completely right in that you can pinpoint issues, but realistically, I mean, you may have just fallen out of love and try to use that issue as perhaps an explanation to yourself, or as you go through different periods in that disaffiliation, you can look at different things that you've sort of become more disillusioned with. But it is interesting, and what I found was very stark was that the statistics on and you'll obviously please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 4% of Latter Day Saints were LGBTQ plus whatever, and but those
Yeah.
who were former members, it was like four times the
Yeah.
number. Was that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, yeah. That was a really fascinating topic. So, the most recent data from Pew indicates about 9% of adults in the US are LGBTQ. Um, Latter-day Saints, based on our survey, it was less than half of that. Whereas former Latter-day Saints, it was twice that. So if you're a former Latter-day
That's right.
Saints, a former Latter-day Saint, for some reason, at least these are the people that responded to our survey. And I also want to point that out. There are a lot of former Latter-day Saints. Who knows how many? We don't know. That have no interest in participating in a survey related to their former religion. Right? They've moved on. They're like they see the advertisement or they get the postcard in the mail saying, "Hey, would you like to participate in this?" And they're like, no, I have no interest in this. I've totally moved on. We don't know what they think. We don't know how they feel. We don't know their beliefs or practices. However, the former Latter-day Saints that are like, aha, I would love to share my opinion about my former religion. We do have their thoughts. And are their beliefs and practices different than the former Latter-day Saints that have no interest? Probably. I would not be surprised if there's measurable differences between those two groups. We only have one of those groups, so that's an important thing to sort of to understand when interpreting these results. But for whatever reason, we have former Latter-day Saints are twice as likely to be LGBTQ as the average population in the U.S., which I don't. I there are many questions I have about that, which I don't know the answer to, but it's a significant difference. And similarly, I have a lot of questions about why there are half as many LGBTQ Latter Day Saints within the church. Perhaps they identify in a different way. Maybe I think a cynical view might say, well, gosh, if they're LGBTQ, they're in a hostile environment. The church is hostile to them, and so they're going to leave the church, uh, and that's why there's so few. Um, uh, Maybe a more optimistic view would be like, well, these people have come to terms with, maybe nuances in sexuality, and they have decided, hey, I identify as a son or daughter of God, and I have a heteronormative view of the world, and so I'm not going to subscribe to the way the world labels me. I We don't know. We don't know. We just know what the data says, and the data is not a little bit off. It's massive, at least in sociological context. These are huge differences between these populations. Something else that we found interesting was about half. We asked about what people thought about same sex ceilings within the church, and about half of LGBTQ members of the church were sort of uh, neutral to negative on the idea of same sex ceilings.
Hmm.
In other words, if, say, you are a gay Latter day Saint, and someone said, "Hey, do you think the church should seal gay couples in the temple?" Half of those people would be like, I don't think so. I don't think they should." So that was very interesting.
Was it your survey that had uncovered the stats on like 90% of women opposed female ordination, and it was like half of men opposed it?
Oh,
Was that yours, or was that a
yeah,
different
that
one?
was actually a different survey
Right,
that
right.
covered that. What we found is overwhelmingly, if you're a member of the church, you're totally okay with the way things are set up now. There's a
Right.
as far as that goes, but they're definitely, again, the 80 and 20%. The 80% are like, we're fine, that we're okay with the current gender roles as it relates to priesthood. But if you're in the 20%, yeah, they're not okay. They're not okay with that. Again, these are averages, generally speaking. But that's, yeah, there is a distinction there, but it's relatively small.
It's illuminating for me as I see from recent conversations I've had on the podcast, as I increasingly see my ward as a covenant community, bound to each other by covenant, to support each other, to comfort each other. And it's illuminating to see that actually there may be a difference in views that I hadn't thought of before, that I hadn't,
Yeah.
I can confidently say things from the stand and not realize that it may not be the shared view of everyone there that you may assume
Yeah, I
because
think that's
I'm
important to understand. Because the this 80-20 sort of grouping, um, the 20% tend to be less active, again, as a group. However, uh, you know, on any given month, if you're at the pulpit speaking, you're going to have dozens of these people in the congregation with you, that are believing members of the church selectively. They identify as Latter Day Saints. They're showing up. But if you say something like, um, you know, I have a strong testimony in tithing, and I'm so glad that we can sacrifice um, our worldly possessions, and put them on the altar of God. And they might be thinking, "No, I am not okay with that, and that is not part of my testimony." And we think, we take things for granted. If you say, "I know Joseph Smith saw God in Jesus Christ in the Sacred Grove," significant number of people are going to be thinking, "I don't think that happened." But yet they're still there. They're still there. They're part of our community. They're part of our ward family. And people evolve. People change. Now, our survey, of course, was a point in time snapshot. So we don't know what direction people kind of flow between the groups. This is something that's really interesting. I didn't bring up that, but if you take the moral foundations theory and you apply it to the two groups, the all in and the selective Latter day Saints, you actually find the selectives are very similar to former Latter day Saints, except in purity.
really.
Yeah. So if you talked about moral foundations, it would be difficult to tell the difference between a Latter-day Saint who's in the selective group and a former Latter-day Saint, unless you see that purity mark. And the 20% is like, look, sacredness is important to me. Whereas the former Latter-day Saint says, you know what, I don't care about sacredness at all. I don't value it. And that's the difference between that. That's the only difference.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting. So even though you're at the pew, or you're at the pulpit speaking to the folks in the pews, um, the commonality is this concept of the sacred, which is kind of neat. It's kind of beautiful, that there really is some common ground there, around this idea of the sacred and the pure.
which I really love. I love that. Taking your occupational hat off and being seeing it from a point of view of a faithful member invested in the church and in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Um, how do you feel about the results of the survey in general, looking at the future from the state of Gen Z in the church and millennials who will be coming into leadership positions now? And I would add on to that question, what do you wish the general member coming across the survey? And I'll link it below, and I really encourage people to go read through it because it is fascinating. I know there are 3 Deseret articles that if you don't want to wade through data, maybe more of a better snapshot. But what was my question? I
Well,
went off on a
uh,
tangent. Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, what do I think of
What
the
would you
survey? Yeah.
advise? Yeah, and what would you advise the general member to kind of do?
Well,
What do you wish they would take from it?
yeah, well, let's start with that. I think the survey is valuable in a few ways to the sort of general membership. One is to understand um, about themselves as a member of the church. To know that when they look at the data and they say, "Wow, gee, where do I fit in?" Um, just know that there are people in their ward family, in their religious faith, that maybe aren't quite like them, and to be aware of that, and to appreciate that, and to consider, because I think if the more aware you are that there are different types of Latter Day Saints, the more empathy you can have, the more love you can have, the more understanding you can have, and I think you can make the church more welcoming to people that maybe are in a different place. So I think there's a lot of value in that, is just recognizing, hey, this data indicates that there's different Latter Day Saints that still identify as Latter Day Saints. Um, and also understand maybe the voices online that you hear um, aren't as maybe big, or might not be as small as you think. It depends on what bubble you hang out with online. But just to see, hey, look, here's some representative data, um, and the true numbers might be different than whatever your internet feed tends to tell you. So it's I think it's important to sort of touch the data sometimes that's representative and say, oh, okay, this is kind of a picture of how things really are. Obviously, no survey is perfect, but the representative data is going to be a lot closer to reality than sort of what our day-to-day experience tends to be. So I think that's healthy, just to connect with the data. The other thing I think is important is to understand, I think most Latter-day Saints have friends or family, loved ones that have decided to disaffiliate, that have left the church. And I think the data here, the survey, can help them understand, okay, um, they think about the world in a different way than I do. Not just, hey, I'm going to argue about anachronisms in the Book of Mormon with them. I mean, like, them leaving the church doesn't have to do with that. At least not at this stage. Where they are is they see the world morally in a very different way. And to understand that, communicating with them and loving them and being part of their life, to be aware of sort of how they see the world, morally speaking, I think can really benefit how we work with them.
Absolutely, and I think my personal reflection on the study, and I'm talking not 30,000 foot level overview, but me personally, the value I found in it was seeing the value of the temple for me and the blessings of attending the temple, and reminding me of how grateful I am and how privileged I feel to be on the earth at a time where my wife and I can be sealed in the temple and have that shared experience together, and not just experience but shared goal. I think looking at the data, that was a really standout thing for me. And I know we touched on this earlier, but there was a lot of questions about marriage. So no, I thank you and B.H. Roberts for doing that incredible survey. I'm sure it took a lot of work, but I do see so much value in it, and I would encourage people to look at it. I'm a huge fan of Mormoner and B.H. Roberts. I followed Mormoner Instagram, and every time there's an article released, I am on there reading it fully through. I found it so valuable.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
My big question is, do you think of the Mormoner memes yourself?
Just the good ones. No, on rare occasion, I'll author a meme myself. In the earlier days, I was more involved in that. We actually have it's sort of a team effort on the memes, and some are great, some are awful, but we just it depends. It's quite funny. Some memes will do really well on Facebook, and do really poorly on Instagram, and some will do really great on Twitter, and then do really, like it just there's different audiences that connect with the meme. So hopefully at some point we connect with everybody. But the whole idea, of course, behind the memes is really just to put a smile on your face for a fraction of a second, in the middle of your day, just to remind you that there's humor in the gospel and in being a part of this faith.
Yeah, I love them, and I appreciate how obscure some of them are. Every now and then you'll get one, and I'm thinking, okay, I've got to do a bit of research
Yeah,
to
yeah. Some of them,
understand them.
can get obscure, and some of them are more mainstream for the normies.
The normies. Well, Josh, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, and there's so much to talk about with what you're doing with B.H. Roberts and Mormoner. So I'm sure we'll have you back soon. But in the meantime, how can people best keep up with what you're doing?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, probably. Well, we have a newsletter. Mormoner has a newsletter, and where we occasionally will talk about some of the projects that we're working on. So if you go to mormoner.org and subscribe to the newsletter, of course, email newsletters are very boomer. But that's probably the best way. Or you can subscribe to one of our socials, and we'll occasionally make announcements of some of the new things we're doing. If you want to connect with us live and in person, we'll be at the Mormon History Association, which is coming up in a few weeks in Kirtland, which will be a lot of fun. There we have the Mormon History Association and the B.H. Roberts Foundation jointly have a scholarship grant. We give two or three. This year we're doing three $5,000 grants to independent researchers that are doing research on Mormonism and Mormon-related topics. So we'll be awarding those this year. We did the same thing last year, and so yeah. So newsletter, one of our socials, or meet us in Kirtland.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh. I'll stick all those links below, and have a great day.
All right. Thanks, man. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.